nothing but the truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges. August 15th, 2022 is a historic day for India. It is when India celebrated its 75th year of independence. And to do that, I went to listen to Prime Minister Modi as he addressed the nation from the ramparts of the Red Fort or Lal Killa. I always enjoy doing it because to me, when you go there and listen to not just the marching, the bugles that are blowing, the bands that play, but also to the Prime Minister speak, listening to it live makes it feel that you are a republic. And especially when the 21-gun salute happens and the entire place vibrates, you feel the energy of the nation. This time, Prime Minister, as typically that he does, made a soaring speech where he exhorted us not only to look out for our rights, but also for our responsibilities. And he talked about the Panchprans or the 5 aims for India to become a Vikasit nation by 2047 when India completes 100 years of independence. In this episode, we will analyze what India has done in the past 75 years, what all has it achieved, and what more does it need to do if it has to achieve and attain the goal of becoming a developed nation by 2047. So before we deal and look at what India did in these last 75 years for its citizens, let's go back in history. Almost 200 years ago, when the British subjugated India, India was in fact one of the richest nations in the world. It contributed, in fact, something like 24.5% of the world's manufacturing output. And UK, United Kingdom, that conquered India, had only 1.2%. In 150 years, the process was reversed completely. UK now contributed as much as 20% of the world's manufacturing output, and India just 2%. So when Prime Minister Nehru made his famous Tryst with Destiny speech and talked of India awakening to a new life and freedom, what we did awake to was not just freedom, but also great poverty. In fact, at independence, it was estimated that more than half the people, in fact 60 to 70% of the people, were below the poverty line and lived in stark conditions. So the founding fathers, as well as the ones that began ruling India from 1947, had to focus strongly on reducing poverty, disease, hunger, and depravity. The Constitution of India, which was enacted 2 years later, apart from laying down the entire process of governance in the country, talked in its preamble of the 4 basic principles which the nation should resolve to deliver to its citizens. And these are critical. It talked of justice, social, economic, and political. It talked of equality. It talked of fraternity, and also looked at liberty. All these 4 are critical for a nation as it began, the young nation that it began. And it is a good way to look at whether in these 75 years we have fulfilled these 4 principles or not. Now, one good way to judge this is to look at the state of democracy itself. Since independence, we've had 17 Lok Sabha elections, close to 350 assembly elections, and hundreds of local body elections. The good thing is that the Election Commission of India that had conducted these elections for the Lok Sabha as well as the assembly elections has upheld the best traditions of democracy and has been rarely criticized for being unfair or biased in any way. What that shows is that 75 years later, India is not only the world's largest democracy, but it's one of its most vibrant ones. And it is a true miracle that while other nations have seen major changes that have happened, even our neighbors, where we saw a tremendous amount of strife, the army has never stepped in and taken over the state as it happened in, say, Pakistan. And that is to the credit of not only just the citizens, but the leaders as well. While we did immensely well on political freedom, when it came to economic freedom, there has been a lot of controversy. When Prime Minister Nehru, our first Prime Minister, took charge, India, as I said, was immensely poor. Nehru had a very hard task ahead of him. He was a visionary leader and was known as an institutional builder and has an outstanding record of that. But when it came to the economy, he believed that the government should take charge and that public sector undertakings rather than the private sector should be employed to build what he called the temples of modernity. So all the major core sectors was dominated by the public sector, and the private sector was generally looked upon with a certain amount of distrust, and more so multinational corporations, given the colonial hangover and the fear that they would continue to dominate the Indian economy as they did in the past. Nehru also believed in the mantra of self-reliance, and that saw a lot of protectionist measures being taken, including raising the tariff barriers for importing goods and protecting infant industry so that they do not face competition from foreign companies. While no doubt Nehru was an outstanding statesman and believed that the path that he took in the economy was the right one, others would argue later that the neglect of the private sector, the inability to harness the enormous entrepreneurial potential of India and rely more on bureaucracy and government institutions would actually begin to hamper growth and slow India's pace in terms of economic development. Nehru was also criticized for being naive in trusting China and was ill-prepared when China began an attack on India in 1962 and India and its army faced a humiliating defeat. Nehru died a saddened man, but his legacy continued. I'm not going into all the prime ministers that India has had, but I'd like to mention a few, and of course, certainly in this list is Indira Gandhi, his daughter, who took over prime ministership after Lal Bahadur Shastri, who had a very brief tenure, but an outstanding one. And Indira Gandhi, in fact, took the socialism or the socialist philosophies that Nehru had to even greater heights. In a controversial move, she nationalized all the banks and limited or placed restrictions on core sector, particularly on private industries wanting to participate on them. Of course, Indira Gandhi is lauded for her decisive win against Pakistan in the 1971 war that created Bangladesh. Indira Gandhi was also praised for starting the Green Revolution that brought self-sufficiency in grains, food grains for India, and also in 1974 when she conducted India's first nuclear test. But then she began to lose her way. By then, political strife had set in the country, there was unemployment, and there was inflation caused by the oil shocks that had happened globally. When there was huge political protest and Indira Gandhi was unseated by a court, a high court, the Allahabad High Court, she declared an emergency in 1975, and it was one of the darkest periods of India's history. It was during this period that she descended into dictatorship, and the nation would make her pay heavily for it. Though she had postponed the elections for a year, in March 1977, when general elections was held and the emergency was lifted, the Congress party was for the first time defeated since independence. And a new Janata government came to power. Indira Gandhi would make a comeback when the Janata experiment failed because of internal contradictions. But it was her son, Rajiv Gandhi, who took over as Prime Minister after she was unfortunately assassinated in 1984, that would bring a whole lot of modern thinking to governance and a fresh breeze to it. It would be the unlikely duo of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and his Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh that would usher in far-reaching economic reforms. He ended the so-called license Raj and unshackled the private sector and freed them to the point that they allowed the animal spirit, as they called it, of entrepreneurship to roam free across the country. That single act created a revolution because prior to that, India's economic growth was barely 2 to 3%, but since then, it began averaging 6 to 7%, and the GDP within a couple of decades reached close to $3 trillion, and India became one of the world's largest economies. The other prime minister that brought economic reform or pushed the cause of economic reform was Atal Bihari Vajpayee when he was prime minister. Apart from conducting a nuclear test and trying to build relations with Pakistan and defending India during the Kargil war, which he is lauded for, Vajpayee not only brought in infrastructure development, but also opened out key sectors to the private sector, particularly the telecom sector, and the tremendous change that it resulted in when private players were allowed to participate in this sector. We are all benefiting now, right up to the fact that we are going to soon get 5G, and that trigger happened during Vajpayee's time. The next big period came when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh took charge in 2004, and the economy boomed. It was around this time, in fact, as soon as he took charge for the first time as Prime Minister, that they launched this massive welfare scheme called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that provided succor to a whole lot of rural India that had still been wallowing in poverty. In fact, it is estimated that during this period, that the two terms that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was in charge, that the poverty levels dropped significantly and that over 200 million people were lifted above the poverty line. Now that is some achievement. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh would face problems towards the end of his second term for completely different reasons. There were allegations of corruption, and the economy by then had begun to slow down considerably. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi took charge in 2014, he not only introduced a whole lot of new schemes for the poor, but also implemented them at a scorching pace. Among the very well-known programs that he has launched for the poor was the Swachh Bharat mission, which saw that toilets being provided in every household across the country, all the poor households, both in urban and rural areas. Then, apart from that, was the entire program to build houses for the poor, as well as bring tap water supply to their households and cooking gas. All these measures are well remembered for. Apart from his welfare measures, Prime Minister Modi also brought in major economic reforms in the shape of a goods and services tax, as well as in terms of having an insolvency and banking code that helped clear up a lot of debt that had mounted over the years in what was called the twin balance sheet problem. I'm not going into those details, but suffice to say, when you look back at these 75 years and look at the progress that we are looking at, that is the economic progress that we have made, there is plenty to be proud about. And of course, there's still a lot to be done in this particular area. If you look at some of the things that's been achieved, and let's talk of the basics, which is roti, kapda, makan, and of course, then bijli, pani, sadak. These are the bare necessities for Indians. And while we made rapid strides on providing the bare necessities for the people, the poverty levels, though reduced substantially from independence, where it was around 60% and now down to 20%, there are still close to over 240 million people who are below the poverty line. So when we gained independence, we had about 343 million people who were below the poverty line, and now we still have that many numbers. And the reason for that is that India's population has expanded exponentially. And we are now close to 1.4 billion people. That makes us the second largest or the second most populous country in the world, next only to China. And in the next 2 years, we are likely to emerge as the most populous country in the world. Now, if you take a look at some of the big achievements that we've done, one of them is the fact that our life expectancy has increased from an average of 32 years to 70 years now. 32 years in 1951 sounds incredible, but it was a fact. The reason for that is that with better nutrition, better health care, and better facilities, our survival rates have grown considerably. Death rates have reduced considerably, and also is birth rate. So there is a slowing down of India's population growth, and these are very good signs. If you take a look at the number of people that have electricity at homes, earlier barely 30 to 40%, particularly in rural areas, had it. Today, close to 90 to 95%, both in urban and rural areas, have electricity at their homes, and also they have potable drinking water. But when it comes to rural areas, in terms of having a tap being installed at home where they can draw water, that number is still around 40 to 50%. But because of the Jal Jeevan mission, that target is going to be achieved rapidly. And because of the Swachh Bharat program, people have toilets, so that has improved health and hygienic conditions at home. And therefore, you are seeing a major change in terms of the approach towards bare necessities that are there. You've almost done that. Also, when you look at things like building roads, there's a huge amount of rural connectivity that has happened. And rather than bullock carts, that used to be the main mode of transport in the past, we now have tractors and auto rickshaws flying on these roads and creating greater connectivity, and therefore better market conditions for farmers and also for children looking to aspire to go to other towns and cities to study. And this has brought about a dramatic improvement in the way we are living. Now, these are all laudable things, but of course, there's still a whole lot of work to be done. If you look at the numbers, even where in terms of cooking gas, 40% of people have now gas cylinders in villages that are there, but 60% still don't have them, and they use firewood. Even in urban areas, the coverage has been quite enormous, close to 80%, but there's still work to be done. And if you look at the numbers, despite all the major advancements we have made in providing basic amenities, there are still 400 million people who need to get pure drinking water to their houses, who still don't have toilets that they can use, who still are looking for housing, and some of the other, in terms of per capita income, they are still far, far low. And though there has been a huge increase in per capita income, moving from close to 300 to 400 rupees when he gained independence to now rupees 1.25 lakh. That is a substantial increase, but when you take a look at the overall amount, it is around 10,000 rupees a month per person, which is still a long way to go when you compare it to developed countries. India is an aspirational country. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi mentioned that in his speech at the Red Fort on Independence Day. And he talked about the Panchpran, or aims that we need to do. And among that was to become a Vikasit Bharat, or a developed country. Now, this is a laudable goal, but we have to do a lot more things than what we're doing now to allow that to happen. Of course, we also need to mention that while we talked of economic freedom, in terms of personal freedoms and expression, there has been a growing feeling that it is being constrained, with even simple tweets getting people put into jail, and a growing intolerance on this count. This is something that we need to be careful about, because as states, whether it's the center or the state, begin to take on powers on the guise of protecting national security, they are more likely to abuse those powers. And so even as we look at economic development, it is very critical that our personal freedoms are not impacted, and the fact that when we talk of liberty, we mean these things. And also to ensure the unity of the country, and that is one of the guiding principles that we have. So while we keep these two very clearly in mind as we move forward, apart from the third being democracy and the fourth being economic growth, as we try to strive to become a developed world so that we live in, all of us live in greater prosperity and not just a few of us, some of the things that the government needs to do is not to make the mistakes of the past. And one of them, as we know, was when you shackled private sector or individual entrepreneurship, the economy grew at a very slow pace. The moment you freed it up in 1991, during the period of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Dr. Manmohan Singh, you saw economic growth go like this. So keeping that in mind, it is very important that as we go ahead, we allow the private sector to have an even playing field. We give them the incentives to do so, bring down regulation, bring down government interference, and of course, ensure that the taxation is not stifling. This would see a burst of activity as it has been, as we have seen in the last couple of years as well. And the fact that Prime Minister Modi has been pushing for privatization, we have seen Air India being sold and now in the hands of Tatas. These are moves in the right direction to stir the investment as well as economic growth. Of course, one is not against public sectors in toto. If a public sector industry is to be established or to continue, it must justify its existence and the resources that is being put onto it. There must be greater accountability, and not like before, that it was just presumed that they would continue and do business as usual. So these are very critical caveats for the nation in terms of economic growth, that we allow industry and manufacturing and the free enterprise to flourish in this country within the constraints that whatever that is there in terms of it, so it doesn't become exploitative. But it is very important that we have this opportunity, that we are at a very sweet spot where we are recognized across the world for our entrepreneurial spirit, for our democracy, and as a great alternative to China. And that is why we need to tie up and boost exports in terms of getting connected to the global value chain. That's very, very critical. So India must make every effort to be globally competitive. And it is estimated that if we wanted to be a developed country, a Vikasat Bharat, as Prime Minister Modi said, we have to grow our per capita income at the rate of 12% every year for the next 25 years. So we have an immense task ahead of us if we have to achieve this goal. So let's play like Team India. I'm going to put on this cap that I was gifted when I went to the 75th anniversary celebrations at Lal Killa. I'm going to put it on and say thank you for listening to this episode, and look forward to having you with me next time.